Should we be running by pace or heart rate or running power? Well, the good thing is that modern sport watches give us the ability to capture all three, but which ones should we use and when? And should we use them in combination or separately? Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. Hope everybody is doing well, is happy and healthy, is having a chance to get out there and exercise. So I think it's an interesting question, sort of which of these matrices we should be running by, and I figured I should take a few minutes for us to go through the pluses and minuses and the use cases for them. And so I thought I would start with heart rate, if for no other reason because we've heard so much about running by heart rate zones, and I have no argument with sort of spending most of our time running in zone 2, with some zone 4 or 5 thrown in for VO2 max and things like this. The reason I want to start with that is there are some very interesting artifacts which occur when we run by heart rate that I think we need to be aware of so that we're not misled by them. And in particular, we have cardiovascular lag and we have cardiac drift, which are very interesting. So let's talk about them one by one, and starting with the cardiac lag, and I'm sure all of you who have run by heart rate, and even those of you who haven't have noticed it, is that it takes a little while for the heart rate to catch up when we pick up speed. I think it's most noticeable when we run up hills, that your heart rate feels fine until you get to the very top of the hill, and all of a sudden it's much higher, much faster. That is not a bug, that is quite frankly a feature of human physiology, but it obviously introduces a problem if you want to throw in some faster runs in the midst of your regular run, because any heart rate monitor that you will have will lag behind and will not show you the effort that you're actually running at, the power that you're producing in a timely manner. And so what's the remedy? Well, if we're running on ground that's flat, you can just keep an eye on your pace and how much your pace increases, right, when you start running faster. If you're running uphill, then running power is probably more appropriate, especially if you want to maintain your running power as you're going uphill, rather than, as most runners do, run up hills too fast and run down hills too slow. And so the second artifact that we want to talk about is cardiovascular drift. And what that means that after you've been running for about half an hour or so, your heart rate will drift up, even if you're running at the same pace with the same effort. Once again, it's not a bug, it's a feature of human physiology, it's just something that happens. But in particular, if you're running by heart rate and you're not aware of it, it may cause you to slow down, to bring down your heart rate, which would actually be the wrong thing to do. Because what you actually want to do, especially if you're sort of on a zone 2 run, running flat, trying to maintain a heart rate and therefore a pace, when you reach the point of sort of cardiac drift occurring, you actually want to maintain your pace or your running power and let your heart rate drift up a little bit. It's just something that is going to do, it's inevitable, and it's just something for us to be aware of and keep an eye on, right? So it occurs after you've been running for about 30 minutes or thereabout. Now, cardiovascular drift, for those of you who want to understand what's going on, is actually caused by the increase of body temperature, core body temperature, that is. It's the same thing that would happen if you were running sort of in warmer weather, all of a sudden running at the same pace on your regular trail would result in higher heart rate, and that is exactly what happens when our body warms up internally. It results in higher heart rate. Now, interestingly, what happens here is that what really happens is the stroke volume of the heart decreases a little bit, and therefore to maintain the same level of oxygen output, the heart rate has to go up a little bit to compensate for it. So once again, a perfectly natural thing to have happen. But once again, if you're running exclusively or predominantly by what your watch is saying in terms of heart rate or your heart rate monitor, then you need to be aware of it so that you're not fooled by it. So where does that leave us with regards to running by heart rate? Should you be relying on your heart rate monitor exclusively? Well, maybe not, because you could be misled a little bit about that, right? If you're going on a flat run for less than 30 minutes and you're therefore not going to get either of these two effects, then you're probably fine. But if you're going to be running on terrain that is somewhat uneven or running longer for 30 minutes, then you obviously need to be aware of both the drift and the lag to make sure that you actually get the run that you're planning on getting and therefore achieve the results that you would like to get. And therefore, it may not be a bad idea to also keep an eye on your pace, keep an eye on your running power, in addition to your heart rate, to make sure that you can dial these in and get the exercise that you're actually looking for, right? So if running by heart rate isn't sort of the perfect thing to do under all circumstances, should you be running by pace instead? Well, my thinking about pace is there are a couple of use cases that are particularly good for it and others that are maybe less so. So clearly if you're running a race and you have a certain time and therefore a certain pace in mind, you will primarily be looking at sort of if you're on pace or not. That just makes sense. And similar, if you're training for a race and would like to train at your intended race pace, then obviously keeping track of the pace is the thing you want to do. I said primarily, not exclusively. And the reason for that is, once again, conditions might vary, whether it's weather, temperature, humidity, and things like that. And so in addition to sort of primarily running by pace, you probably also want to keep an eye on your heart rate, for instance, to make sure that you're not burning yourself out and running at a heart rate that is significantly higher than you would like to be running at. And similarly, if it's somewhat hilly, you may also want to cast a glance on sort of running power to make sure that you're managing those uphills and downhills in the way that you would like to be managing them, so that once again you don't sort of overexert yourself and then suffer the consequences further on your run. So what about running power? Should you be running by running power instead? Well, I think there are instances where that may not be a bad idea. If you're going for a long run and you don't want to be tricked by the cardiac drift, then clearly running by running power, once you've established the relationship between, for instance, your zone 2 heart rate and your running power on flat terrain, assuming that that's what you're doing, may not be a bad idea. And similarly, if you're running on hilly terrain and you don't want to overexert yourself on the uphills, then running either by running power, which you can obviously maintain, or grade adjusted pace may not be a bad thing. The good thing about running power is that it adjusts very quickly, once again, in contrast to heart rate, which lags and which drifts. And so you get a much more timely measure of how much effort you are exerting in your run at any particular point in time. The other case for using running power, which I find particularly useful, is that if you're both running trails and road, it might be very useful to do that by running power, because it helps you to maintain similar level of efforts if that's what you're looking to accomplish. I think we can all appreciate that running on trails can be much more demanding than running on asphalt, especially if the asphalt is flat and the trails are undulating. You could easily, if you're trying to run, for instance, by pace, end up running at very, very different efforts, which once again may not be what you want to do. And so dialing in your running power and running by running power allows you to actually compare much better the effort that you're exerting on your road runs and the effort that you're exerting on your trail runs, and therefore being able to manage it in a way that makes sense to you and fits with your training plan. So where does that leave us? Well, I don't think there is a single ideal metric, as I think we all understand. I think we're really talking about horses for courses, right? It depends a little bit on the circumstances and what you're trying to accomplish. And so, if you're running flat, if you're running for a short period of time, sure, running by heart rate is probably fine. On the other hand, it may be useful to try to understand the relationship between your zone 2 running, for instance, and your running power if you're going to go on a longer run so that you're not tricked by the drift, by the cardiovascular drift. And similarly, if you're running on something that's undulating, for instance, up and down, and you want to maintain a level effort, then once again, running power might be the thing to do. On the other hand, if you're running a race or if you're training for a race and you're aiming for a certain pace, then clearly the pace will be your primary metric. But once again, keeping an eye on the other two to make sure that you don't overexert yourself and then suffer the consequences further in your run. As a general rule, I actually think it is very useful for us to dial in the relationships between heart rate, pace, and running power, especially for sort of runs that we do on a regular basis, so we have an understanding sort of how they relate to each other, and so we can adjust which one we're looking at and understand what it means. And given that many of us probably have trails and roads that we run on a regular basis, dialing that in shouldn't be terribly difficult, and I actually think quite useful. And now I want to hear from you. What has your experience been running by any or all of these? Whether it's heart rate, pace, running power, which ones do you prefer under which circumstances? Please let us know below so we can learn from what you've been doing and what you've learned. And with that, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it useful. Be well and happy running. Take good care, everybody. Bye-bye.